As Don said, my name's Joe, and I was thinking about this. It's really been my privilege to be a part of this global learning community for, I almost hesitate to say, about 25 years now. During that time, I've been a classroom trainer. I've managed instructional design organizations. As Don mentioned, I've done consulting to help other organizations reimagine or rethink their learning strategy. And I've even had the opportunity to lead the learning organization at 4 global enterprises. And even as I say that, it sounds like I can't keep a job. But it's not the case. It's just been so much opportunity in L&D, and so it's really appreciative. I've also had the opportunity to appear at events like this, and in fact, I was here almost a decade ago at this event and delivered one of the early versions of this, of the Workplace Learning Plenary Session. And during that time, I called on us as a profession, as learning professionals, to embrace or to recognize what I called learning at the speed of need. And learning at the speed of need was really all about the thinking differently about how we did things, how we design, develop, and implement training programs. But it was also about being much more closely aligned to business. Now think about this, is 10 years ago, about being more closely aligned to our business partners. So I was really grateful for the organizers to ask me to come back and talk a little bit about, what the trajectory has been over the last 10 years. And the good news is, I think in that time, I've seen a lot of progress. I think we've made progress. But at the same time, you sometimes feel like it's not quite enough, or we're not moving fast enough, that somehow we struggle to get out of our own way. I mean, here it is a decade on, and I'm still here talking about, about this thematically. And so that got me thinking, what is it? What's going on? What is a blocker? How come we can't get out of our own way, it seems, at times? And is there some, catchy or memorable way we could discuss this so that we could bring in others, other colleagues and partners to kind of discuss it? And that turned into the title, as Don referenced earlier, what I talk about today, to stop being a hammer looking for a nail. Stop being a hammer looking for a nail. Now, the original quote is actually, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then it's okay that you probably treat everything like a nail. Has anybody heard something like that, a variant of that? Yeah. I've heard it literally my entire life, certainly my entire career. Actually, Abraham Maslow said that in The Psychology of Science in 1966. And it turns out, I borrowed it somewhere along the way, and those that have worked with me know that I'm fond of saying we need to stop being hammers looking for a nail. So it was shortly around the time of this event, about 10 years ago, that the dots sort of connected for me, my aha moment. The light bulb went off. And it was around that time I was brought in by a large financial institution to reinvent, to reimagine their learning function. And so, being somebody that wants to do this, I wanted to get out very close to the business partners to understand what's their expectation of us. How can we be of better service as we reinvent this learning organization? So I gathered my new team together, and it was a sizable organization. Right? So we had training facilitators, we had instructional designers, we even had an e-learning department 10 years ago. Right? I had e-learning folks. I had technology people to help me run the learning management system, and I brought along a project manager to help me kind of organize all that. And so we brought the management team together, and I dispatched everybody to go off and meet with our frontline business partners to kind of get an expectation from them of how we could be better. Now, the first one back, sort of the first meeting that finished, was led by our instructional design manager. And so I asked her, how did it go? And she said, well, we were about 3 or 4 sentences into the conversation, and I could begin to visualize, I could begin to very clearly see the classes that we were going to need to provide to help them. Okay. Now, the second one back, it was my e-learning manager. So same question. How did it go? And he said, well, it took about 10 minutes or so into the conversation, and I then sort of had a pretty good idea of the modules we had or that we were going to have to build, to help solve their problems. In fact, it was a really productive hour. We spent the rest of the time together scripting out what those modules are here. And he handed me a list. Now, the third one was the project manager who came back. And I had sent the project manager out as well. I thought it might be good for some of our clients to hear a different voice, a different perspective than they had in the past. And he said something really interesting to me. It got me sort of on this trajectory. I asked him how it went, and he said, well, in fairness, Joe, about 60% of what they were talking about, I don't think it had anything to do with training. Now, there were a couple of things. I did hear a couple of things that if we had some kind of, I don't know, performance support or a desk drop or some kind of material for them, I think it's low-hanging fruit. We could add some value. As far as the rest of it, not 100% sure. We might need to go back and spend some time with, I don't know, some of their better performers or something and really try to figure out what we need to teach them compared to what, say, they could learn on their own. I'm sorry, boss. He apologized. Sorry, boss. And it bothered me all night. It got me thinking, that's really, really interesting. Now, 10 years ago, the first two responses were pretty much acceptable, right? I mean, that's often what kept our trainers and our design teams and our book of work filled and busy, and we even used it as a success metric, right? Because we could point to our business partners and say, look at this ever-increasing catalog of content that we built for you, and claim that as a victory. But here was somebody, you know, so that's when it's kind of struck me, right? That I had very obviously sent hammers looking for a nail into those meetings. I mean, now in hindsight, does it surprise anybody that the instructional design manager could clearly visualize what classes had to be built, or that the e-learning manager knew exactly what modules we needed? But the third person, right, that project manager, had no horse in the race, right? At least not in the traditional learning and development sense. They didn't really care if the answer was going to come back that we needed to facilitate a class or build a module of any sort. They were simply focused on what's the issue, what's the problem, what's the underlying issue, and how is it impacting the business results, right? They came away actually with more questions than answers at the time, and then I began thinking about it. That's probably how we needed to operate all of these years. And I would suggest that in today's business environment, particularly if we're going to be aligned more strategically with the business, it's probably really our only chance for success. And so that first major mind shift or change or trend that we're beginning to see, and I think would be the appropriate thing for us to do, changing our operating model a bit, is to move from being the classic training department to being more of a performance consulting organization. As Richard said, it's about performance. If we're going to add value there, is that the move we have to make? And if we're going to do that, we got to ask ourselves some pretty tough and challenging questions and really be brutally honest with the answers. So if we're going to be the classic training department, or are we going to move towards performance consulting? And another way to ask that question might be, are we comfortable being order takers? You know what I mean by that, right? If anybody's ever shown up at your office to your team and said, build me a 30-minute computer-based training module on, well, pretty much anything. Or we would like a 3-day class, right? Or a 5-day session on this or that, then you know what I mean, right? That's order taking. And historically, look, a lot of times that's where the training organization has been placed organizationally or thought of. The last stop along the road, not a strategic partner. Kind of like, well, we'll do some training, and we enabled that by always building the content to solve that need. Hammer, meet, nail. Right? Are we comfortable doing that? Or perhaps we could use that very question as the jumping off point for the consultation. Welcome that question. Come on in. Sit down. Why don't you tell me why you think a 30-minute module is the answer here? What's that 5-day class? How did you arrive at that conclusion? Could you help me understand the behaviors you're trying to change and maybe get the priorities straight? So questions like that. Are we comfortable that the data from our learning management systems is the gauge of our success? Or should we be more aligned to the actual business outcomes? Are we comfortable being hammers looking for a nail? Or do we truly want to be strategic business partners? But, are we also prepared for the consequences that come along with that? But if you buy into it, if you adopt this performance-first mindset, essentially that sort of opens up some new avenues for you, right, in this. And now you can begin to think about a lot of things differently, including how we design, develop, and implement any learning and training in the organization. And I would suggest that our businesses, if we talk to them, if we're more aligned with them, would appreciate us pushing learning from the more formal way we've always done things in the past to pushing that out closer to the workflow, where the users are. Helena mentioned it. Richard mentioned it. You know, it's about performance. It's about not taking people out for large blocks of time, destroying their productivity, and trying to push this learning closer to the workflow. It's another place where we need to stop being hammers, right, to rethink how we do this. And it kind of gets to the core question for me around, do we care what our people know, or do we care more about what they do? Do we care what they know or what they do? Now, in a way, it's a bit of an unfair question, right? Because the answer could be both. It's not binary. It's not yes or no, right? But and I can understand. We mentioned compliance earlier. You know, I can see that compliance is one of those places where we care what they know. But by and large, you know, the vast majority of the time, when it comes to performance in the business, it's about what they do, right? It's a lot less about what they know. And we have to fight that. It's almost a natural human temptation as an educator, right? As a subject matter expert, as a human resource professional, even as a parent, right? Our natural temptation is to deliver information and then more information upon that and more information upon that in the hope that, you know, a well-informed learner is sort of the outcome, the end result. In workplace learning, that's just not the case, is it? Right? Here, we need to know that they can do. The fact that somebody knows something doesn't necessarily follow that they even care, right? Or, when called upon to act, that they're going to be able to execute the tasks needed to demonstrate success. So I think we have to kind of guard ourselves a bit about that information overload, and pushing things out into the workflow, well, that's going to be a way to help do that. That becomes sort of the supporting strategy of the first piece, right? If you're going to move towards a performance consulting model, this gives you a way to get there. Your solutions begin to be built just enough and really no more. You know, they're not disruptive to production. They're out there closer to the workflow. And a good way to start, right? People ask, well, how do I start? A good way to start is to flip the script. If we think a little differently, if we think differently than the way we've done it in the past, perhaps starting at the user experience and working backwards until you fix the problem or get them unstuck, and then stop. Build no more. That's all you need. If a performance support piece is all you need, then that's all you need. Don't build any more. But I know, I've been there, right? We're going to have subject matter experts and sponsors of your training that insist there's more to it than that. There's other information you must give them. You know, by all means, build a reference library of that material. But that's a secondary activity, right? Your success shouldn't be tied to people using that material. That's just sort of there, I guess, for the, I would say, for the curious, right? Now, in the interest of time, I wanted to kind of table a third thing for us to consider today in our discussion about changes in our operating model. And that one, I would call it, you know, content creation versus content curation. You know, creation, curation. Beginning to see more of this as I work with organizations. And the question becomes, if we're again brutally honest, as a profession, generally speaking, it seems like our default mechanism has always been to create our content, to build our content internally. And look, I've heard all kinds of reasons why. I mean, over those 25 years, I've probably scripted a half a dozen of those reasons and used them myself, right? But the fact is, the reason I hear the most, whether working for or with an organization, the number one reason I hear to defend this has been, well, Joe, we have to customize the content for the way we do it here, right? Which is another way of saying we're special, we're unique, you know? But I think we have to call that into question, right? At the end of the day, it's most often from the subject matter experts or for those that believe they have a voice in the training that you're building, because they're experts. They want every piece of knowledge, right? Every nugget of information, every nuance to be expressed, because that's the world they live in. They don't live in the real world where we have new joiners and new starters and people still on the journey to become experts like that, right? So I think we have to be careful when we're thinking about, do we always have to build this content? There's also another elephant in the room that has to be addressed when it comes to content creation and curation. That is, look, that's how many of us got our start, got our jobs, remain employed. It's often been the value proposition that we've offered, at least until now. And so, there's a number of considerations, right? And, you don't move real quickly in this space. We have to think about this. We have to work through it because it could have impact on the people, some in this room or some on the teams represented by the people in this room. But here's a way to think about it. If you're going to step into and adopt the first couple of ideas, we're going to move as strategic business partners to become more of a performance consulting practice. If we're going to begin to push learning to the workflow, that takes capacity. You need capacity. You need time and people to make that happen and to make it happen well. I look at new organizations I've been part of, and I'm willing to bet your organization's no different. Nobody's ever once in my career come to me and said, here's an open checkbook and unlimited headcount. It doesn't happen. In fact, usually, right, we get, you need to do more with less. You referenced it earlier, right? So that's the reality of the situation. So we need to create the capacity to do those first two things. And I would submit that one of the great places to take back capacity is simply to, create less, leverage more of what's available and begin to move ourselves into the realm of curating content and not always relying on being the creators of that content. The world is filled with terrific content. And look, to address that question about we're special here, at the end of the day, ask the learner, ask the person on the front line who is stuck, who needs our help, who needs the, quote, training to get unstuck and back to work. And the reality is, they don't really care whether you built that brilliant content or you borrowed it from me. They just want to get back to work. So the question becomes, what's your value proposition? That you can create or still create brilliant content, or that you can become curators of brilliant content sets culled from places all over, right? Not just inside your own organization, that are always up to date, relevant, and meaningful to me in the context of the role I'm performing? That becomes the question. Now, I think I want to get us back on track here. We want to get to your questions. So I don't want to suggest that stopping being a hammer is easy, right? It's not. It takes time. Go slowly, right? It has served us well many times over the years. It's always going to be a part of our arsenal, right? But I can tell you this. I can promise you that it is liberating and empowering and vastly more interesting to be included as a truly strategic partner with the business outcomes. I can also assure you of this. If it isn't already the expectation of your business partners, it will be very soon. Now look, some of you, if you're already there, I congratulate you. But for the majority of us, if you're still on this journey, well, that's why we're here today. We're here hopefully to help. So I'll turn it back over to Don and the panel.